and welcome again to this webinar. We are very pleased to have this event hosted today by Mr. Sterling K. Skern, the CEO and President of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and Ms. Tori Deedle-Hops, Senior Partner for Deedle Partners. We'll turn to Sterling. Prior to joining the Kellogg Foundation in 2006, Sterling was the Chief Executive Officer and President of the Peninsula Community Foundation. He launched the Center for Venture Philanthropy and co-founded the Peninsula's Partnership for Children. Welcome, Sterling.
Thank you, Robert, and let me extend my appreciation to our partners and colleagues at the Rural School and Community Trust and to my co-host, Tori Deedle-Hops. I am very honored to be co-hosting this webinar. As many of you may know, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation was established in a small town in western Michigan where we still have our headquarters in Battle Creek, and some of the very earliest projects had to do with the opportunities that rural children in 6 rural counties in western Michigan, the challenges and obstacles they faced just because they were rural kids. And we focused a lot on education and health back in those days, and we continue to have that emphasis. More recently, we were delighted to support the Rural School and Community Trust when the Investing in Innovation initiative came down from the Department of Education. And while we were a little disappointed at the ability for many rural schools to compete for federal funds at that point, we are delighted for the technical assistance and capacity building that the Rural School and Community Trust has been doing since that time, and we expect to continue to work with the Trust in that manner. And again, I want to thank Marty Strange and Robert and everybody at the Trust for organizing today's webinar. So welcome, everybody, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Sterling. We appreciate you being here and all the support that we've received from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tori Deedle-Hops. She is a senior partner for Deedle Partners, a multi-generational family-to-family philanthropic advising firm. She is co-founder of the Rock Hop Partners, a company that develops materials for parents and children. Tori, your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you, Sterling, as well. I'm here today because of our 5-year funding partnership with the Rural School and Community Trust, and I'd like to open by describing a bit about Deedle Partners' philosophy regarding the role of private philanthropy as a backdrop to today's presentation. We believe that private funders have an opportunity to be a trim tab. Now, some of you may not be familiar with that term, so picture the rudder on a big ocean liner, if you would. Partway down that rudder, there's a little tiny flap. This little flap is what moves first when you want to begin to turn a big ocean liner in a new direction. In playing that role of trim tab, private philanthropy has often provided what is termed risk capital in order to test new approaches or innovative solutions. Additionally, private giving also plays the role of patient capital, understanding that system change typically requires a long time horizon. So there's the philosophy, but how about the context? All of us on this call find ourselves operating in a period where the pressure and necessity to make the best use of dollars has never been higher due to the economic situation. We believe economic uncertainty is a very productive accelerator of change. In our practice, we look to find opportunities to take advantage of the current economic pressure to bring traditionally unlikely partners to the table and to take bold steps in the various interest areas of our clients. Deedle Partners believes that both types of capital, risk and patient, are fundamental to bringing about positive change. We're keenly aware that private philanthropy is a drop in the bucket compared to the resources that government can bring to bear. As you are all likely aware, last year private foundations provided approximately $45 billion in total grants across a vast number of programs and entities. The Title I program, which you will hear some about today, spends $14.5 billion on the education of disadvantaged children. So in this context, private philanthropy's ability to support the case for better use of public funds is a potent role for philanthropy. Given the trends you will hear about in today's presentation, we believe that we have a moment in time where there's an economic and moral imperative to rethink how America supports rural education and the children in these schools. We are truly pleased to have the opportunity to share this time with you, our colleagues, and look forward to discussion with you after Marty's presentation. I am pleased to introduce Marty Strange, Policy Director at the Rural School and Community Trust since 1997. He is co-founder of the Center for Rural Affairs and today's presenter. Marty, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon or good morning to you all, depending on where you might be. Thank you, Tori and Sterling and the Kellogg Foundation and Deedle Partners for co-hosting this event. We're here because rural children in their schools are largely invisible, and our aim is not only to make them more visible, but to make them an important center of attention for federal education policymakers, and to empower rural people and their voice in that process. A short word about the Rural School and Community Trust. We work in a number of ways all across rural America. We're concerned about rural schools everywhere. We do capacity building for teachers, leaders, students, citizens. We do professional development with rural teachers. We offer place-based learning, that is rooted in the student's real world. We do research, especially on public policy issues. We offer rural education organizing and advocacy services to help rural people shape public policy. And we do rural school innovation, discovering and sharing authentic rural school innovations that work in the places they were intended to work. Today, we want to talk about some realities of rural education, some of which you might find surprising. We want to talk about the changing role of federal education policy in general, specifically how that affects high-poverty rural schools, and some of the things that need to be done by advocates and philanthropists to make federal education policy work better in rural schools. So, some realities of rural education. First, averages can be deceiving. For example, if you take a statistic like the percentage of students of color in rural school districts, nationally the average is 25.8%, but in New Mexico it's 82.6%, and in Vermont it's 4.2%. In fact, 2/3 of the states either have more than 36% children of color or fewer than 16% children of color. So the national average really doesn't describe hardly anyone. And we can often make mistakes in policy analysis in rural settings by assuming that the national average is meaningful. We're concerned about all rural schools, but we're especially focused on the highest poverty ones. We track the 900 rural schools that have the highest Title I eligibility rate. Here's a map showing them. These are classic, historically poor, high poverty, persistently high poverty rural regions. The Southeast, Central Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, the Hispanic borderlands, the Ozarks, the Northern Plains Indian reservations, the Southwest Indian reservations, the Upper Rio Grande Valley, the farm labor country in California. These are classic high poverty rural regions. And one important note to make here is that the highest concentration of rural disadvantaged and minority students are in small rural states where rural people are a demographic majority or a very large minority. The rural 900 schools, in fact, are a majority children of color. 28% of them are African American, 23% are Hispanic, 8% Native, 59% children of color. The student poverty rate is very high. Here we see the poverty rate as measured by census data. This is not the free and reduced price lunch numbers. That would be much higher in all of these school districts. But here we see the rural 900 in the red bar at 37%. That's a poverty rate higher than all of those other large urban school districts except the Bronx and Detroit. Rural school enrollment is growing. This comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but the reality is that in the 4 years prior to the last year for which data are available, that's 2008-2009 school year, rural school enrollment grew by 1.2 million, from 10.5 million to 11.7 million. It grew also as a share of the national school enrollment during that same time period, from 21.6% to 23.7%. And the fastest growth on those rural school districts is among children of color, 31% increase in 4 years, from 2.4 million roughly to 3.1 million. But despite this increase in prominence and despite this increase in need, children in rural schools remain largely invisible. They're a demographic and political minority in all but 3 states. They're geographically dispersed, and dispersion is the enemy of political power and influence everywhere. Many small-scale political units are represented in these school districts. And as we pointed out earlier, statistical averages often mask the need that is extreme in some of these districts. But invisible or not, rural children matter. And if our nation's goal is to improve achievement for all and to narrow the achievement gaps between advantaged and disadvantaged groups, we've got to begin to face the reality of these rural children. We've got to make them visible, and we need to address their issues as we see them. There are some characteristically rural challenges. Now, these are not all unique to rural areas by any means. Many of these same challenges face other schools, and they're not as severe in some areas of the rural America as they are in others. But these are characteristic of high poverty rural areas, and these problems tend to reinforce and aggravate one another. Concentrated poverty, but in dispersed locales. Small scale, that means higher cost, especially in transportation. Very low levels of adult education in these communities. Very little, virtually no, public transportation. Very minimal public facilities. A telecommunications infrastructure which is lagging. Limited access to health care and social services. And undiversified local economies that have low-paying, low-skilled jobs. So take, for example, an issue like hiring quality teachers. We find that teachers and leaders are isolated. They're often the most highly educated people in a rural community, and it's hard to lure new people into that setting. Also, the housing and entertainment and social networks that are especially important for younger teachers are very limited in these areas. Salaries are systematically lower, so fringe benefits are much leaner, and there are fewer job opportunities to fill out the summer months. And that means also far fewer jobs for spouses who are, especially spouses who are themselves well educated. Local rural labor markets just don't offer many opportunities for spouses. If you are able to hire a high-quality rural teacher, retaining them is also a challenge. Because these are usually smaller schools and have smaller faculties, especially at the high school level, there's more course preparations that have to be made by each teacher. That means more certifications have to be maintained by each teacher. There are fewer opportunities for maintaining those certifications through professional development, although distance learning is making an important difference here. We're still a long way from home. There are a lot fewer service providers and support personnel in these schools. They're just leaner all around. And that means teachers and leaders have to take on more co-curricular activities if the school is to offer those kinds of opportunities to children. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that these places are pitiful. While all these problems are real and need to be dealt with, it's true that these rural areas also have strengths and assets and characteristics that are of benefit. There's a lot of research on the reasons why smaller schools do better for low-income children. Lorna Jimerson did us a report on this a few years back called The Hobbit Effect, Why Small Works in Public Schools. And these are all research-based findings. You can go on our website and look up this report and get the citations. But the reasons are that people are needed in small settings. If you're going to have anything, everybody has to participate. If you're going to have a school play, people have got to participate. Kids experience safety and a sense of belonging more readily. It's easier to use individualized instruction and other good teaching methods in a smaller school setting. Teachers report consistently that they feel better about their work. There's less tracking and higher expectations across the board for all children. In a small school where you have teachers looking after children, children can't hide from the higher expectations. Multi-age classrooms are frequently used as a way to achieve some economies of scale and cut costs, but it's also been shown that pedagogically they promote more personalized learning and positive experience and have a positive effect on student achievement. Smaller districts mean less bureaucracy. You can make a decision where everybody can get in one room who's affected by the decision. And because these are smaller schools, they often have wider grade spans, and that means fewer transitions from one school to another, and that has been shown to be a positive with respect to student achievement as well. It's interesting, going back to that slide for a second, that as states press with budget problems, are looking for ways to cut money, they frequently turn to the school sector and think about closing rural schools as an efficiency measure, and in the process of doing so, they weaken all of these strengths that are part of the rural experience. So how's federal education policy changing? Well, the cornerstone of federal education policy is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Its centerpiece is Title I, by far the biggest federal education program, $14.5 billion in the current fiscal year. It's always been an entitlement kind of program. That is, if a school district qualified, it received the money based on a formula. The federal role, therefore, was very passive with respect to influencing the direction of education within the states or local school districts. No Child Left Behind is the current rendition of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was passed in 2002, and it has begun to change that passive role. A major shift in policy from entitlement to what I call conditional entitlement. That is, states now are still entitled to the money, but they have to adopt certain educational accountability policies that affect not just the schools that are eligible for the Title I funding, but all children in all schools. Have to show adequate yearly progress toward 100% proficiency in reading and math, using universal standardized testing, and there are sanctions if the school or the district don't meet that adequate yearly progress test. There are penalties. So federal funding now is much more activist in pushing reform agendas onto the states. It's also true that this same activist role has increased the federal influence in state policy through the competitive grants programs, which have increased dramatically in recent years. The Race to the Top and the Investing in Innovation programs, which were both passed not under the Education Act, but under the stimulus program. To be eligible for a Race to the Top grant, states had to demonstrate policy commitments. They had to agree to adopting internationally rigorous standards and assessments. They had to show plans for more effective teacher recruiting and development and leadership, teaching, recruiting and development. They had to build data systems that were much more complex to measure student success and to track improvement. And they had to focus on turning around their lowest performing schools. States had to take these steps in order to submit an application. And whether they got a grant or not, they're expected to remain consistent with what they said they would do. The current battleground over reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is now we're 3 years or more overdue to reauthorize it, and there's some pretty big issues on the table in the Congress. Should there be a smaller or larger role for federal funding in accountability standards and, most controversially, in curriculum? Should there be more or less flexibility in the use of targeted federal funds? In other words, if you have a grant pile of money from the federal government that's for the education of English language learners, can you decide to use that for special education or for disadvantaged students generally? And there's a lot of debate about how much more flexibility should be permitted. What kind of accountability system will the federal government demand for the use of its funds? And will the focus be on lowest performing schools only, or on much broader path of schools across the country? And charter schools. Will there be more funding from the federal government for charter schools? Will it be accompanied by more rigorous standards of accountability? And probably the most controversial is linking teacher pay to the testing performance of their students. But no matter the ultimate direction in any of these controversial areas of policy, the choices made must take into account rural schools and their characteristic challenges and assets. Our invisible children need visibility and they need voice. So how does federal education policy affect high poverty rural schools? We want to talk about 3 issues today. The first one, and the one that we'll probably spend the most time on, are the inequities in the formula for distributing Title I funds and how those inequities discriminate especially against small and rural schools. Secondly, we want to talk about the competitive grants and the uneven playing field that they represent for rural school districts. And third, we want to talk about rural education research, and the infrastructure for that is very weak in our nation. So inequities in the Title I formula. The Title I formula is a conditional entitlement, but it's still distributed by formula. And the formula includes a weighting system that is designed for a perfectly good reason, and that is it's designed to send more money per pupil to the school districts with the highest concentrations of poverty. I want to make it very clear that we strongly support that purpose. However, the weighting system, as it's been designed, doesn't accomplish that goal. It's good intentions, but bad unintended consequences. Here are some of the baffling variations that we see from school district to school district across the country. If you look at this, you'll find that the lowest poverty school district, that would be Queens, the second line, has a 16% poverty rate and gets the most Title I money per pupil of all of these school districts. The 3 districts with the lowest, or with the highest poverty rates, that would be Philadelphia, Mississippi at line 1, Gallup-McKinley, New Mexico at line 4, and Adcoach-Elsa, Texas at line 7, get the lowest amount of money per pupil. Now those are all rural 900 school districts. If you look at districts within the same state, Queens and Rochester in New York, Gallup-McKinley in New Mexico, and Albuquerque in New Mexico, and Garland and Edcouch-Elsa in Texas, you see very different poverty rates, but in each case, the district with the lower poverty rate gets more money per pupil. Now, some of this variation is due to the fact that the formula uses state-level spending of state money on education as a trigger for how much Title I money is sent per pupil to these various districts. But that only accounts for some of the difference between, for example, Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Queens, New York. And it explains none of the difference between Queens and Rochester, New York, because they're in the same state and they have the same state-level spending. What, in fact, explains the rest of the differences here is the weighting system. Now, the weighting system actually consists of 2 different ways of inflating the student count so that more money goes to certain districts. One is based on percentage weighting. The higher the percentage of Title I students in a given school district, the higher the student count is inflated, and there's the potential for more money. The other weighting system considers simply the sheer number of Title I students in the district. The bigger the number, the greater the inflation in student count, and the more money per pupil will go to those districts. And it doesn't matter what percentage that they total of all the students in the district. Now, which of these systems applies to which school districts? Well, both of these weighting methods are applied to every district in the country. But the method that inflates that district's count more is the one that goes into the formula for that district. And it's very important to understand that when a lot of school districts are having their weight, I'm going to call it weight, the student weight increased, you can gain weight but still lose money if you gain proportionally less weight than others. And that's exactly what happens. If on average, nationwide, every Title I school student, I should say, counts as 1.8 students in the formula, on average. But in some school districts, it counts as 1.2 or 1.5 on average, and in some it's 2.3. Well, the ones who gain weight at 1.2 and 1.5 level are losing money, and the ones that gain at 2.3 are gaining money. So there's a certain perverse effect of number weighting, and that is this, that the number weighting math, the numbers used in the weighting system, the number weighting method, are so much more powerful than the weights used in the percentage weighting system that it simply outmuscles percentage weighting. And it's so powerful that it essentially neutralizes percentage weighting. Percentage weighting doesn't have any effect on the distribution of funds under this formula. Instead, number weighting rules the day. And the result is that money is taken from 90% of the school districts, no matter how, the smaller 90%, no matter how high their poverty rate, and it is sent to larger districts no matter how low their poverty rate. So money leaves Philadelphia, Mississippi, and it goes to Fairfax County, Virginia. Philadelphia, Mississippi has a 41% poverty rate. Fairfax County has a 5.5%, barely high enough to qualify for a Title I grant. But it gets more Title I money per pupil than Philadelphia, Mississippi. And it's because of the number weighting system. Now, here's a table that looks a little daunting, but bear with me. I think you'll get a very good picture that goes beyond those anecdotes about the baffling numbers. I broke down all 12,000 plus school districts in the Title I formula and into 4 groups. And I broke them down by percentage of poverty. The very high poverty, low poverty, very low poverty. And I broke them down so that there were roughly a fourth of the Title I children in each of the 4 groups. So we had the Title I children going to the very high poverty school districts, and the Title I children going to the very low poverty school districts, and so on. Now, when I looked at the results of Congressional Research Service analysis of the impact of the number weighting system, what I discovered was that the net effect of the number weighting system was negative. That is, the schools in that group lost money only for the very high poverty school districts. So a formula that was supposed to send, a provision of the formula that was supposed to send more money to the highest poverty districts actually was taking it from them. But within the very high poverty groups, I wonder if they're all losing money equally. So I went into the very high poverty group and I broke them down into 4 groups based on size. And size as defined by the number of Title I students. And this slide shows the effect of that analysis. These are only the very high poverty districts. You can tell from column 3 that they're all up there in the mid-30s in terms of percent poverty. And you can see from column 2 that I put about 554,000 or 560,000 kids in each of the 4 groups. That's to give them equal quartiles. And the districts with a very large number of Title I students are in row 1. There's only 6 districts. And you can probably, some of you might be able to guess who they are, and I'll tell you who they are. It's Kings County, which is Brooklyn. It's the Bronx. It's Philadelphia, Detroit, Houston, and New York County, which is Manhattan. Well, those districts, if you look at column 4, gained money, and everybody expected them to. And there's no shame in the fact that those districts benefited from the system. But look at the small and very small, and remember, these are all very high poverty districts. The small and the very small lost money, and they lost it in chunks, big chunks. So the net effect among all very high poverty districts was losing $33 million. But all of those losses and more were experienced by the small and the very small alone. That was not the intent of Congress. So I decided to look at the very low poverty districts to see and break them into size groupings as well to see how they come out under the same analysis. And here we see that the very large, in row 1, very low poverty districts gained money. And in fact, if you look at that blue number in column 4, that's what they gained. I'm going to go back now to the previous slide, and I want you to compare that number with what the very large, very high poverty districts gained. High poverty, low poverty. High poverty, low poverty. Now, the small and the very small of these low poverty districts lost money, and everybody expected them to. That was what was supposed to happen. But this blue number at the top here was not supposed to happen. The Fairfax County Virginias were not supposed to gain that kind of money from this formula. And who are these districts? Well, they're mostly suburban, large suburban districts. Prince George's County in Maryland, Gwinnett County in Georgia, Baltimore County in Maryland, Fairfax County in Virginia. Districts that have resources, that are well off, that have very low rates of poverty. All of those are at a rate of half or less the national rate of poverty. And yet they are benefiting more than high poverty, very large districts in our major urban areas. Now, the argument is that there's a lot of poor kids in Fairfax County, so they just aren't a very big percentage of the population of the school enrollment. Well, let's consider 5th grade in 2 districts, and these numbers are not exact, but they're basically based on the figures for Fairfax County, Virginia, and Philadelphia, Mississippi. So the small rural school district has 4 5th grade classrooms, 25 students per classroom. The large suburban school district has more like 650 5th grade classrooms, 25 students per classroom. That means that the teacher in that rural school district with 4 5th grade classrooms is looking out at a class of 25, and 10 of those kids, on average, are living in poverty. It's a 40% poverty rate. It's actually 41%. The teacher in the large suburban school district is looking into that classroom with 25 kids, and 1 or 2 of them are likely to be living in poverty. I say 6% here. It's actually 5.5% in Fairfax County, but we're being generous. So the question becomes, which classroom teacher should get more Title I support? Now, each of these classroom teachers, in each of these cases, is facing a challenge, but they're not equal challenges. And to that teacher, with those 25 kids in his or her classroom, it doesn't matter to either of them how many classrooms there are in the school district. Poverty has its impact in the student-teacher relationship where the rubber meets the road in education, and that's in the classroom. But number weighting says, no, If you've got 650 fifth grade classrooms, you need more help than if you only have 4 fifth grade classrooms. So the result is that number weighting takes money from small, high-poverty rural districts and sends it to large, low-poverty suburban districts. The high-poverty rural district, in the case of Philadelphia, $85 less per student, $850 less per classroom. Low-poverty suburban district, $275 more per student, $412 more per classroom. It's simply not the way this was supposed to be, but it is a problem that's very real. Remedies? Well, in the old world, the remedy for this kind of a problem was to eliminate the number weighting system and appropriate additional funds so that you can hold harmless those who currently benefit from it. So that going forward, number weighting is not a factor, but those who benefited from it get paid for giving it up. That's not the world we live in anymore, because there's not going to be increases in appropriation. So the alternative is to gradually reduce the weights in the number weighting brackets in order to weaken number weighting relative to percentage weighting. And that's a measure that has been introduced in the House Education and Workforce Committee, H.R. 2485, All Children Are Equal Act. It's the first piece of legislation in this Congress, in this committee, that has bipartisan support. The lead Republican is Glenn Thompson from Pennsylvania. The lead Democrat is G.K. Butterfield from North Carolina. And it's got currently 14 co-sponsors, 8 of them on the committee, and it's bipartisan. So, turning past Title I and looking very briefly at the uneven playing field that we're coping with in the competitive grants program. When you look at Race to the Top, 39% of the money in the first round went to Washington, D.C. and 6 states that we, using our statistical measures that we use to rank the importance of rural education in a given state, the 6 states rank 44th or lower in rural education importance. Only 5 of the winning states in the Race to the Top competition have even one rural 900 school district, and only 2 have more than 2% of their students in rural 900 school districts. These grants were not meant for rural states. The Investing in Innovation program, only 3 of the 49 funded projects involve innovations that were expressly applicable in rural settings or serving high-needs rural students. And the reason that rural high-poverty districts especially have a hard time competing in this field is that they lack the staff capacity to write proposals. I mean, the grant writer is usually the superintendent or the principal, and she or he may be also driving the bus every day. There's a preference in the guidelines for these projects for large-scale programs. Very difficult. You can only do it if you organize large numbers of rural school districts to participate in a cooperative cluster, which takes a lot of time and effort. And there's enormously weak rural education research infrastructure to support innovations that are addressing characteristically rural challenges. Weak regional education service sector, most of them poorly funded, many of them barely able to keep their own doors open, and not in a position to deliver the kind of assistance that most of these districts need. Now, it's an irony, of course, that the strongest regional education service units are in the states that have the lowest rural poverty levels. And, of course, there's the digital divide. This is getting better, but it's still an issue, especially if you're going to try to organize school districts across wide territories to participate in a project that will have the kind of scale expected of competitive grant programs. So we think you need to build prior support into competitive grant programs, and by that we mean help organizing larger scale projects that involve interlocal planning and coordination so that rural schools can work together on an innovation that will be of value to them and will be rooted in their own real experience. Technical assistance in grant writing and research design, organizational capacity building so that these schools have the capacity to implement a successful grant application, and The one thing I want to caution about is the notion that frequently comes up of setting aside funds for a separate rural competition only. It's not really a good solution because without these prior supports that I'm talking about, the more well-off rural regions will simply outcompete the poorest rural regions. If you set aside money for rural only, it's going to go to places like Vermont and Minnesota and not to places like South Carolina and Alabama. Finally, the rural education research infrastructure I've mentioned before. You know, the American Education Research Association had their annual convention this year. They had about 8,000 papers and posters presented. Of those, roughly 40 papers or posters addressed rural education, and about a fourth of them were rural education in other countries. Most of the remainders were case studies. There were very little rigorous design kinds of research projects. And of 13,000 attendees of conferees, about 30 participated in the Rural Education Special Interest Group meeting. There isn't much cachet in doing education on rural research, and we need to change that. And one of the things that we've done to change it is to establish an Office of Rural Education Policy within the United States Department of Education to get a better focus on rural education aspects of current programs, to look at new proposals and new policies to see what their impact will be, and to commission some scholarly research on rural education. The bill has been introduced to that effect in the Senate, Senate Bill 946. It's something that we strongly support. So what advocates and philanthropists can do to help? Our priorities are visibility and voice, as I've said a number of times. We want to provide some insight, develop policy alternatives, and forge a stronger rural identity. It's going to require organizing people, networking groups together, and forming coalitions with non-rural education groups, all for the purpose of advocating for equity and improved performance. In visibility, we do a biannual Why Rural Matters report. We'll look at 25 statistical indicators in each of the states that reveals the condition of rural education and the need for policymakers to give attention to it. We did, with the support of the Kellogg Foundation, a study of the impact of the Investing in Innovation program that had a supposed rural preference for the guidelines. We issued that report called Taking Advantage, and it had big impact.
Muted.
As far as stronger rural identity goes, we want to provide opportunities for rural groups to network nationally. We sponsor a rural education working group meeting where people get together, learn skills from each other, develop common cause, develop leadership, share experiences, network. And there's a picture of a recent meeting of the Rural Education Working Group. We've got people here from this particular table from Alabama, Arkansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, West Virginia, working through an organizing issue, thinking about how they can be more effective in their own states and with their own organizations in improving education in their communities. And as far as voice goes, we support grassroots education organizing. We begin in each state in the hardest places, because if you don't begin in those places, you'll never get to them. We start with issues where people are concerned about my school. That's what people care about. That's where they feel they can manage an effort to improve things. But as time goes on, we network people working locally into a state level of organization where they begin to address public policy issues. We support them with research on those issues and with networking, as I just described it a moment ago. And ultimately, we want to weave these state-level organizations together with other national organizations, other education groups into national coalitions and campaigns, the best example of which is the current Formula Fairness campaign to address the Title I issue. And this campaign involves, as you can see, this is a sample of the organizations supporting the campaign, co-sponsoring the campaign. If you look at the diversity of that, it's pretty amazing. And the roles they play are very important. North Carolina Rural Education Working Group, for example, met regularly for a period of many weeks with Congressman Butterfield, educating him on the importance of addressing the Title I issue. When he attended the news conference announcing the introduction of the All Children Are Equal Act, he said, "I'm doing this because my constituents back home have taught me that this issue is important, and I'm being responsive to what is clearly a well-recognized need among my constituents." I sat at a meeting with a Senate education staffer. With one side of him was a representative of Save the Children, and on the other side of them was a representative of the American Farm Bureau Federation. Now, I can tell you those two organizations have never been in the same room together advocating on the same side of anything in the past. But they were there, and they made a difference. We got that support. You can see in the National Alliance of Black School Educators, the American Association of School Administrators, both of those organizations have members who are beneficiaries of the current number weighting system. But both of them take the same view. And that is, you got to be for equity all the time, not just when you're on the short end of the stick. You got to be for equity all the time. And so they've taken this to their boards, and they have argued it out, and they've come out on the side of equity in the Title I formula. And my hat's off to them. And Ruth Gray of the National Alliance of Black School Educators is just one terrific lobbyist. She's smart, and she's been around a long time. And she is able to talk to people in a way that it's hard to ignore the sincerity and the depth of her commitment to children of the hollers of West Virginia just as much as children in the Bronx. So are there opportunities for philanthropy? You bet. We hope that you'll support advocacy. Rural education needs a voice at the policy table. We hope you'll support organizing. It's patient work. It's patient work. It takes a long time. But rural partners are stronger when they're working collectively, and the investment over time is worth it. Support research. Research is woefully underfunded, and it could be a real potent force for change, but it isn't much support for it at this time. And support innovation. Help us and other groups find what works in high-poverty rural places, but find innovations that have been generated from the practical experience of good educators in these high-poverty rural places, and get recognition for that innovation and get policy support for it. Those are all the kinds of things that I think philanthropy can do that's very, very important. So our messages are today that it's time to bring rural children and their schools and communities in from the cold. They're a growing part of America's educational landscape. Their needs are growing, and we cannot hope to meet our national educational goals if we continue to
unmuted.
Children are invisible. We want to make these children visible. They deserve it. They want it. They need it. Thanks very much.
Marty.
Yes.
Rob Mahaffey here. Thank you very much for the presentation. Okay, and now for a few closing comments from Tori Dietl-Hobbs.
Thank you, Rob. I wanted to, number one, thank everyone for joining the call today, and two, Marty, thanks to you for taking some very complicated and quite detailed conversation and really doing an excellent job with making it digestible to those of us who don't spend every waking hour in this work. I wanted to just say I found that the slide in particular on poverty's impact in the classroom was a great example of the power of showing visually what is occurring as a result of some of these policies. If any of you on the call today would like to talk colleague to colleague about funding in this arena and or in particular funding of rural school and community trust, I am more than happy to have a conversation with any of you. My contact information can be found on DietlPartners.com, and I would welcome any further discussions. And Sterling, off to you for final comment.
So thank you, Tori, and my hats off and great thanks to Marty and the team. I found the presentation not only informative but truly illuminating, and despite the bleak prospects like closing rural schools, inspiring. That this information and everything from formula fairness to prior support for competitive grants and the list of good ideas Marty put at the end in terms of advocating, organizing, researching, and innovating. I think there's a lot of promise if we as funders and as partners can work together. I was pleased, as Marty referred to, the impact that the analysis of the disadvantaged rural schools had in the investing in innovation. One report, but the allies and strange partners that he described that came together on behalf of rural education is hopeful. I also found the map of the poor rural districts very helpful too, in terms of targeting especially those of us who work in rural areas. I also want to thank you on this call, whether you represent an institution or an individual donor, a regional funder, or a national funder, that there's great work to do here. I know Secretary Vilsack from the Department of Agriculture was in Battle Creek a week or two ago, and he talked about continuing to provide support for rural philanthropy. But I think support for rural education should be probably the point of that funding sphere. And I also want to congratulate Marty and his contribution. I don't know how you got the Wall Street Journal to do that wonderful article last week on one-room schoolhouses, but the profiles of those tiny districts, and those are exactly the kind of schools I think that we can't afford to let be closed. And my kids went to school at a small K-8 rural school district where there are barely enough kids in the classroom, and I certainly know the values of the Hobbit effect for small schools. So I just want to thank Marty, Rob, Sean, everybody at the Rural School and Community Trust, and Tori, and all the participants. And I hope the PowerPoint and the audio for this will have a long life after today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all again for participating and being part of this webinar. And as I said, the presentation and the audio will be on our website at www.ruraledu.org. Thank you. This now concludes the webinar.